Okay, welcome. Welcome to our webinar of today and warm greetings from Costa Rica. I'm very happy to welcome all of you who are joining us today and also our special guests. Today we'll have a conversation on education with David Orr and Sam Crowell and myself. This webinar is organized by the Earth Charter International and our Education Center under the framework of our UNESCO Chair on Education for Sustainable Development that we co-host with the University for Peace. This UNESCO Chair, in most of our work, is focused on the intersection of sustainability, education, and values. With this, we have developed research and training opportunities to explore this area of that intersection. And we try to address questions such as how to bring the values of sustainability into education in a way that it generates a transformative experience. Since 2005, when we established our education center located here on the campus of the University for Peace in Costa Rica, we have been collaborating with UNESCO in this work on ESD. So for over 10 years, we have developed courses and education programs as a professional development for educators and young leaders in this area of sustainability and values through the lenses of the Earth Charter. You can find more information on this in our earthcharter.org website. So the theme of our website today is on education as if Earth mattered. And it takes place in various contexts around the current times. No? The first is that this week, the United Nations celebrates the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. And it's good for us to remind us on the importance of international collaboration, cooperation, multilateralism, and especially the need of a shared vision in terms of how we ought to live in this shared planet. And the importance for us to look at this as our home. So I really want to frame this conversation also in this historical moment that the United Nations is celebrating this week, the 75th anniversary since its creation, and on the importance of collaboration across cultures, nations, and areas of knowledge for the well-being of all. We also organized this conversation in the context of the 20th anniversary since the launch of the Earth Charter. But this year it has been a special year with a pandemic that from north, east, southwest around the world, we're all suffering in a way or another the consequences of what's going on. And another context that for us to look at education is that we can see an increased lack of tolerance with the different ones, and increased social discrimination, and of course the challenges of climate change and unsustainability in the world. So I'm just sharing this for us to position or to look at the context in which we are organizing this webinar. So let me introduce our two guest speakers, and I'm very happy that both of you have accepted to join us today. And before that, I want to confess that I'm here feeling like a teenager, ready to listen to my favorite pop music stars, or in front of my favorite Hollywood film stars. This is just to give you an idea of how I feel to be in a webinar and in a conversation with David Orr and Sam Crowell. So for those of you who do not know David Orr, he is a well-known ecological literacy educator and writer. He was a professor at Oberlin College in Ohio, USA, and is the author of several books, including Ecological Literacy and Earth in Mind, which is not only a book that has inspired many of us working in the field of sustainability, the Earth in Mind, but I see so many other authors and books that are actually quoting Earth in Mind. In the early 90s, David published an intriguing article called "What is Education For?", in which he talks about 6 myths about the foundations of modern education and 6 new principles to replace them. As you can imagine, this article of David sparked the interest and imagination of many, including me. It has really influenced my thinking for years. And then we also have the pleasure of welcoming Sam Crowell. Sam is a professor emeritus from California State University, San Bernardino, where he was the director at the Center for Research in Integrative Learning and Teaching. He founded an MA in Holistic and Integrative Studies in Education. He's a faculty here of the Earthchild Education Center for Sustainable Development and has been a senior advisor of Earthchild International for several years. His books include Emergent Teaching, A Path for Creativity, Significance, and Transformation, and the Re-Enchantment of Learning. What a nice title for a book, The Re-Enchantment of Learning. So thank you for both of you for joining us today and also for our audience. So let me start with this question, the first question that I would like both of you to reflect on, and I would like to start Sam to start. And the question is, what is the purpose or the role of education to current times? Sam. You are muted, Sam.
Thank you so much, Mirian. Can you hear me all right? Great. And I want to acknowledge all of you who are a part of this. And I hope you will participate in your imagination and questions. And I also want to acknowledge that this is an audience from around the world. And so we come from different contexts and cultures and languages. And so it's such a pleasure to be a part of your presence and to share it this morning. And I also want to just acknowledge I'm in the mountains of Southern California, in a small village, but I want to acknowledge that the land that I'm on was originally part of the Cahuilla band of Native Americans, and their sacred relationship with the earth still continues. And I think it's important to acknowledge those ties and those relationships and those histories that we're all a part of. So I'm thrilled to be a part of this. The purposes of education in our times. What a question. I think first of all, I have to start with the comment that our current education, in my opinion, is quite misguided for the crises and issues of our time. While education and understanding is an important aspect of human life and human learning, the kind of education, the orientation of its purposes are really significant, and we should try to look through that. I want to say that today's education seems to be built around the accumulation of information, and in our current context, information has kind of overtaken even money as a primary resource. But we're approaching it in the same way. The more information we can accumulate, distribute, throw out there, and is kind of a defining quality of our times, in my estimation. But information in and of itself has no meaning, has no real significance. It's how we use that and how we begin to frame the information and apply it into our lives and into our world. It isn't that it's insignificant, it's that it's not a reliable purpose for our times. And there's a kind of an interesting notion that comes from ancient times of what information is or what wisdom is, and it is discerning knowledge. It is information in which there's a process of discernment, of depth, of significant understanding and values. And when that happens, then we start to embody and embrace that information within the context of our lives and our societies. I want to share a quick quote with you that comes from one of my books, but it's talking about a responsive, that education for our time should be more responsive in what we do, where knowledge becomes connected to who we are as human beings. Not just our intellectual capacities, but our capacity for altruistic concern, for selfless service, collaborative action, creative wisdom. And when we apply these to the issues and crises of our time, it makes education something that's personal and has transformative possibility. I actually think the purpose for education in our time is very much related to the sense of sustainability. And for me, over the past few years, the Earth Charter has framed the values surrounding sustainability and the ethical foundations of those questions in a way that I think has amazing importance and significance to our world, because information needs meaning, and meaning is framed by a sense of value. Values are existential choices. Values represent something that we are aspiring toward. And so when we have an aspirational sense where we can enter into dialogue, then the purposes of education can be shared, explored, investigated, collaborated upon, and really just, I suppose, an expansive notion of learning and integration. So I don't want to go too fast here, but let me stop there and let David have more of a particular response.
David, your mic is closed. Unmute it.
Such a pleasure to be here with you, and Mirian, thank you so much for organizing this. A hearty amen to Sam's comments, but let me add two things. One, behind me on the screen is a view from the Acropolis in Athens, looking down at the agora where a good many of our ideas of democracy were formed. Not invented, because democracy had been around for a long time in various forms in tribal societies, but certainly importantly added to. And the thing I'd like to say is that we're in the middle of a global crisis. It's most evident, I think, in the United States and Europe, but it's being revealed all over the world. So in terms of what's education for in a world of pandemics, which takes us very quickly to the organization of the global economy, and then democracy. Democracy under stress here in the United States. We're less than 2 weeks from a major election, which I think is going to be the most important election in American political history. And it's a choice we're having to make of what kind of people we are. And one of the purposes of education, I think, to take a line from E.M. Forster's famous novel, is connect, only connect. And the purpose of education, I think, is to connect us. And then the question is to what? And the first thing I would hope to be connected to is ourselves, our inner life as people, and to be able to grow into the full stature of which we're all capable of attaining. And the second thing is to the people around us, our communities, our locations. And thirdly, to our places, where we live, and identify with those places that formed us and made us. And then fourthly, to our history and to our past. We're the bearers of a remarkable legacy as humans. We know all the downside and the bad things that humans are capable of, but we're also bearers of a legacy. And behind me, again, the Greek experience is embodied in that photograph. And then I think the last thing is a connectedness to the future. If there is any major flaw in the global economy, and there are many that we still educate, it is that we don't include the future in the way we think. In American law, at least, in the US Constitution, posterity is mentioned one time and then not thereafter. But around the world, in Ecuador and in Colombia and the Philippines, parts of Europe, there's a legal revolution that says that future generations matter and our obligations to them, therefore, matter. They should have standing. And so I close this by simply saying that it seems to me that to connect our ideas of citizenship that were first put into language form, in written form, by the Greeks. We are parts of a political community. Their notions were way too small, did not include women or foreigners and so forth, but we're first of all citizens in a political community. And the Earth Charter points out that political community is now global. And so we're citizens also in an ecological community. And this comes together so brilliantly and beautifully in the Earth Charter, but we're dual citizens. And there are flip sides of the same coin, so to speak. You cannot effectively be a citizen in one without being a citizen in the other. So I'll stop there and move on.
Thank you, David and Sam. So I just want to highlight what stayed in my mind, the word connect from David and the word meaning from Sam. And I would like to share that on my part, if we have more and more well-educated people around the world who are not sensitive, and coherent with the well-being of not only people, but the large living world, then education is taking us to a wrong path. So I often ask myself and see that a key purpose of education is to help us be more caring, more sensitive, more responsible human beings, not only with ourselves and with other human beings, but with the large living world. I want to share that in that brilliant report, Jacques Delors' report, made to UNESCO in the late 90s, they identified 4 purposes of education for the 21st century: learning to know, learning to do, learning to be, and to live together. The learning to know and learning to do are things that education has kind of addressed pretty much. But learning to be in the world, to be a better human being, learning to be more compassionate, more sensitive, is probably something that is lacking, and there's a vacuum in our learning system in helping us to learn, just to learn to be a better human being and less indifferent with the needs of others. In learning to live together, it seems to me that in the current world that we are living, we got to learn how to dialogue with the different ones. We got to learn how to sit on a table with someone that thinks in a completely different way and still respect and care. So learning to live together is the 4th pillar of education for the 21st century, according to the Delors report to UNESCO. But UNESCO added a 5th pillar over the past 15 years, which is learning to transform the world and transform the society. So therefore, there are many education for social transformation, movements of education for change that require a significant attention of our education systems so that they don't continue to do the same, the same conventional education that's not really leading or taking us or taking our civilization to the right path. So the second question, and I would like to ask David to start sharing your reflection on that, is can education be envisioned as a driver for a more caring, just, and sustainable world? Especially, how can we envision education as a driver for social transformation? David.
And we have several hours for an answer to that question. But let me begin by saying how much I agree with Sam's point that in its present configuration, probably not likely. And the only way I think to think about education is to be a loving critic of it, but in the best sense of the word critical. It's important that young people know how to read and write and count and acquire the elements that allow them to access the wider world of learning and knowledge and science and philosophy and so forth. They need to be literate in that way. And so education ought to be accessible to everybody at some level. The problem, I think, begins when we talk about the purposes envisioned for educated people. And most of the critiques from John Taylor Gatto and all the way back to John Dewey and before, and all the critiques of education address this thing that what is an educated person for? And the answer the contemporary society mostly gives through universities and even in secondary education is to equip a person to get a job in an economy. And so it's an instrumental kind of thing. It's not a growth kind of thing. It's not educing, drawing forth the person or the potential person that resides in all children. It's to warp them and equip them to make a lot of money. And sometimes that's put very crassly. Mostly it's not, but the purpose of education is given to equip people to make it in this global economy. And so the criteria of education is I think, wrong in that sense. What would it take to make education work better? Well, for one thing, it ought to be funded independently. In American education, and I think increasingly around the world, it's funded by the people who have a vested interest in more or less the status quo, the power structure as it exists. And that famous classic, Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, the oppressed now includes virtually all of us in some fashion. Shoshana Zuboff's book, Surveillance Capitalism, talks about the arrival now of all this electronic media, the networks and social media and so forth, the purpose of which is not to educate us. It is to take control of who we are and then redirect our purposes to their ends, not to ours, mostly having to do consumption, but that's a world run by algorithms, not by people. That's a world of incredibly wealthy people, as we're now seeing. You could get in a golf cart that would hold 6 or 8 people, you could get the owners of half or more of the wealth on the planet in that golf cart. So the purpose of education is, I think, been badly warped. And let me say 2 other things and then stop. I think if we look at the idea of education as a lifelong process, part of which is derived in public schools, say in the formal educational arena, but which goes on well, or should go on well after graduation or somebody leaves school, so that we leave people with more questions than answers, with a real thirst for knowledge, a drive to, as I said previously, to connect, that centrifugal force that draws us out of ourselves and into the wider world of life and history and other people and societies. I think that's the kind of education we want, is to leave people hungry, not with a degree. The last thing I'd say is that, I've written this before, but it isn't the poor that are destroying the planet so rapidly. It's the people with college and university degrees. It's the people who have not risen to the challenge of a full human destiny for all of us. the fairness and justice and equality and frankly, a joyful participation in life. We've built a world that is frantic and desperate, and climate change is just one symptom of that world. It's not the cause of that larger malaise, it's a symptom. And so an education that speaks to that, I think would occur, it could begin in formal schooling, but it needs to take many other forms. And then finally, what do those forms take? Periodically, I've taught at Schumacher College in Devon in the UK, and students drawn from all over the world. And it's a learning experience for everybody in those small settings, but it's usually forms a week or 2 week set of classes in which people engage in all kinds of dialogue and they're living together, and wide-ranging, multicultural. It's hard to describe it, but there's something in the essence of that kind of more spontaneous education that really speaks to the human soul. And at the end of the day, it is education for the soul that really matters. All the rest is kind of clutter or can get in the way of that larger mission. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Sam. You unmute your mic.
You've given us so much to think about, David. That was beautiful. And just if I could just piggyback on just a few comments you made that that really touched that sense of connectivity and connectedness. I think is really a reframing of our mindset for the times that we live in. But it's a reframing in a way that's been here for a long time. The Native Americans have a term called Matakuyasan, all our relations. And so when we view things from a sense of relationship and connection, our whole perspective begins to change. And even a sense of who we are and as a self, as an individual in our world. You mentioned citizenship, and I think the Earth Charter and other facets of thought are now talking and looking at, I prefer the term planetary citizenship to global citizenship. And from the Greeks, the word, there's kind of a word that we use in English called idiot. And in the Greeks, it's idiotes, and an idiotes is one who does not participate in the citizenship, in the possibility of being a citizen and taking a role and an active role in that. So that sense of planetary citizenship and engagement and participation, I think, are so very important. As we look at education, I'm reminded, I think it was Anupan Saraf who asked the question, who do we serve? I think that was you, Anupan. And it struck me. I've held that question for a while. And if we apply that to education, who or what does education serve? It looks exactly, it serves the economic systems of our societies. It serves the corporate mindedness of what we're about. It prepares our students in many ways to enter that world and that world view. I think our challenge is to shift what we're looking at. If we turn in a different direction and say, who does education serve? What does education serve? And we start saying it serves the planet. It serves the people and the species and the beings that are held in such value in a planetary sense. Then our response to that kind of education is going to change naturally. And it's not going to be a forced response, because as we just change our attention, our focus of attention, we have natural inclinations about us that move toward the direction of our attention. And that's the way the mind and the brain works. Where we focus attention is the nature of where the blood flows. So it's an organic facet of our experience. So it seems that those of us in this time, our work, part of our work anyway, is to shift our attention instead of just toward an economic system or to the accumulation of more information and knowledge, to the accumulation of degrees for whatever purpose. It's imperative, it's urgent in my mind to shift our attention to the needs and our responsibilities toward the planet of which we're a part and which we're automatically related to. I've been very fascinated with the work of Jennifer Gidley, who has written a wonderful book on post-formal education. We talk about formal education in terms of schooling, but what would a post-formal education look like? And she does a whole developmental aspect and a shift, and looks at this question from the perspective of shifting consciousness. What does that even mean? How do we shift the consciousness? How do we turn our attention to planetary issues? And she said that there are different kinds of reasoning that are necessary. And you touched on several of these, David, and I just loved it. But she deals with about 12 of them, and I'm not going to spend elaborate time on that. But I just wanted to throw them out because they're common to us in a way. But the first is complexity, where we see paradox and contradiction coexisting. From a modernist perspective and from a factory perspective, we don't allow those to come together and to exist. But in a planetary perspective, in a global context, they have to, because we're multicultural, we're pluralistic, we're going to have contradictions among, and so allowing those to exist in a complex form, in a systems perspective, is really, really important. It's a way of reasoning into the world. Creativity is a second one, which I think is incredibly important. The need for new perspectives. So as we shift our attention, what are the new perspectives that come at us? How can we creatively apply our understandings and our knowledge and our different cultural wisdoms toward that? Dialogical reasoning, very different from dialectical, because dialectical means we're kind of in a forced intellectual combat in a way. And I like dialectics, they're fun, but dialogical brings us together. It's that sense of relationality and connection, and how can we see the world with this shared points of view? What kinds of wisdom can we gain from one another? And I think that's so important in a world that's so fractured right now. And especially in the country you and I live in, David, it's really so problematic. The fourth is ecological reasoning. How do we see things from a sense of context and process and a sense of organism? I think the documentary out there that's been touted for a while now is Kiss the Ground. And it's about regenerative agriculture. And that notion of regeneration is key and fundamental to sustainability. How can we regenerate ourselves and our societies? How can we actually use the regenerative process as in a sense, a kind of biomimicry for our own educational innovations? And then just quickly, futures reasoning, you mentioned foresight and higher purpose, the sense of spiritual and the sense of value orientation that gives us a higher purpose, that deals and confronts those questions of ultimacy, those questions of service, those questions of where does this individual end, and where does my expansive self begin? And how can I embrace that more expansive, holistic aspect of who I am and who we are? Imagination, integration, intuitive wisdom, language reflexivity, looking at the way the awareness of our languaging and how our languaging can actually be quite violent. Linguistic violence should be a part of actually other kinds of violence. Pluralism, and last, reflexivity, to see and reflect on our own thinking, our own biases, our own narratives. And so this process of enculturation that education necessarily participates and leads is enculturation is toward what end? If we shift our perspective, our attention to a planetary perspective, as if, and that as if is pretty, it's pretty certain it matters. It's pretty certain the wealth and the well-being of our planet and the beings on this planet matter.
Thank you, Sam. If we look at education 200 years ago, and education now, and education in the future, right? So probably 200, 300, even 100 years ago, people would go to school or maybe to a university to find knowledge, information, and even a library, right? Now we have all of these in our house if we have internet. I mean, at least knowledge, information. So of course, the role and purpose of education has also changed in that sense of acquiring knowledge. So this leads me to the third question, and I'm gonna turn to David to go first. How would you envision the futures of education? What is that kind of education that is needed, as if the planet matters? David.
Mary, let me say on that note, four things. I think none of this will come as a surprise to anybody, but the education that matters will break up I said a moment ago that the E.M. Forster's epigraph to Howard's end was connect, only connect. And so if the first thing that we need to do is help young people, or people at all ages, to connect to their self. So left hand, right side of the brain, the head, the hands, the heart, the whole human being. And so it's the kind of education that equips people to know who they are and feel good about that. I'm on the board of an organization called Children in Nature's Network, started by Richard Louv. And Rich has done some great work in getting kids outdoors. He calls nature deficit disorder kind of the byproduct or the signature of the television generated couch potato era. But getting kids outdoors so they're in nature. And then if you add to that the competence to do things in nature, to make things, to build, to grow and repair and so forth, those things where you're using the hands. So the first thing I would say in terms of answering the question here, envisioning the future of education, is it needs to have that active component, the engagement with the person, with yourself, and then with the natural world around you. And then it raises a second question, what kind of person do we look for? If we were all of us on this call to say, at the end of the process at your school or organization, what is the product you want to come out? What's the human person you want to come out? And is it somebody who, a lot of synaptic activity, so a lot of brain waves fire and so forth, or somebody with a heart and a good heart and compassion? What's the balance of the thinking and doing and the compassionate self? Mary Midgley, who was one of my favorite philosophers, wrote an essay once on this topic. And she said in the essay that some of her best students got the worst grades, but they were children or people who could mull things over. They weren't the kind of people that make necessarily good lawyers, where they quickly get the whole lot of data and they get the right answer quickly, but rather the kind of people that can take a complicated question off of moral and philosophical aspects and just mull it over. And there's so much of life that is indeterminate. If you try to make a quantitative answer, it doesn't work. There are problems that E.F. Schumacher once called divergent, that they're just not solvable in any clearly numerical fashion. And then I think there's a third question that comes up. We assume that education is about the individual. And in some ways, we're like an ant colony where the individual ant doesn't really matter. It's the collective intelligence embodied in the whole colony that matters. And I think that we're coming to a point where we must realize that a good bit of our intelligence supersedes our individual persons. And it now is collectively built into us. We're more like a hive in some ways than we are a society of individuals. And so here we have to look at education. The question here is the future of education. And we're assuming, I think, implicitly that education happens in schools, in and around schools, formal settings. But education happens on social media now. It happens in television. It happens by the way society is simply structured. Young people pick up all kinds of clues about how the world works. So education, this process of learning and inducement, is also a social process. And so then I think we have to ask what kind of society we become and how do we begin to do macro education. So I saw a study some years back that said that the average person in American society, and I suspect globally, is exposed to something like 5,000 commercial advertisements every day. Now let's assume that number's wildly exaggerated. I don't think it is. If you add up all the advertisements on the internet and billboards and all the things that you see and people wearing ball caps with insignias on, all that is advertising. But that was a product of a world envisioned by a guy named Edward Bernays, who was a nephew of Sigmund Freud's. And he understood that you didn't sell things by appealing to rationality and reason. That's kind of the lodestar of higher education. You appeal to the reasonable person that requires information and so forth. But Freud and his nephew Bernays recognized in advertising, you appeal to the id. So if you want to sell something, you appeal to the lowest part of the human thinking, the reptilian brain, fear and greed and all those kinds of things. And I think the question is, how do we take these modern tools and give young people some way to help think about societal education and begin to look at things like the internet and like social media and like advertising? Because what you learn in school can be undone very quickly on social media. You can appeal to empathy and love and caring in a class. It's undone by a young person who goes back at night and looks at social media and picks up hateful messages, well crafted, well delivered to hit the reptilian part of the brain. The last thing I would say is this is kind of indeterminate. The question is the future of education. And I think that I want to leave aside the formal schooling part for just a moment. And I want to say, in my experience, and I've been involved in several ventures to create small experiential places for schooling. In my experience, it's those small places. I mentioned Schumacher College a moment ago, but many of you on the call are familiar with other places all over the world, small educational institutions, nonprofits with very long names and very short budgets that operate mom and pop outfits that operate by dedication and so forth. But the goal in all of them has been to give kids a deeper understanding of who they are, what they are, and connectedness to the world. And so they, like Schumacher College, they're small in the larger educational world, but rather like salt in the stew. You put salt in a stew and it's small by volume, but large by effect. It changes the flavor of the thing. And these experiences at places like Schumacher, or in my experience, the Metacritic project that we started in Arkansas years ago, and dozens of other places like that, change the perspective because they're immersive and they reach a different level beyond thinking. It's that experience that Mary Midgley described of learning how to mull things over and take complicated questions and think about them and think about them for a long time. So I would hope that the future of education includes lots of off campus experiences, experiential learning embedded in the society, but small places that are underfunded and need help financially and so forth. But they're places that enrich that experience and allow students to to reach different parts of themselves and see themselves in a larger context. And partly, the last thing I'd say is this: being around smart people are a dime a dozen. And Midgley's point in this essay, why smartness is not enough. Her point was that we're around smart people all the time, but it's people who are intelligent in a deeper sense, loving and caring and courageous. That's rare. That's much more rare than just sheer smartness. So I would aim for, I'd hope for a schooling system that includes lots of diverse educational experiences and aims for that larger perspective of personhood. I'll stop there.
Thank you, David. Sam, please unmute your mic and share with us how would you envision the futures of education?
I just want to pause for a second to let David's response soak in. Yeah, some beautiful ideas and visions there. I love the sharing of your experiences in an immersive situation. I've had similar experiences, and when students' lives seem to come together for them in a different kind of way. Certainly with the Earth Charter programs, when we met in person at the Earth Charter Learning Center in Costa Rica, it was that week together that was immersive and collaborative, and it was magical, and so in such a deep and substantive way. It's been interesting as you talked about love and various aspects of those experiences that come out, this sense of transformation, how to put that into into a format that is not in person, but is immersive in a different way. So we've been exploring that through the online courses and certificates in sustainability. And it's been equally rewarding and fascinating to see the life changes and the professional changes that come about when a group of people interact substantively around the issues of our planet, of our time, of our society, and their own lives as individuals. Something I often share, Jerome Harstey felt that there were always two significant questions that any curriculum, and I'm using curriculum in a broad sense, should ask. One is, what kind of person do I want to be given this information? And what kind of world do I want to live in? And those two questions go together. They aren't separate and apart, because the kind of person that we become, we move toward, we grow into is part of giving and service to the world itself, to the social conditions of the world, the planetary ecological crises that we face, and so many others. So that sense of what kind of person and what kind of world, even those questions are going to accumulate ideas around values. Because what kind of person is what I value, what I begin to value in this life. What kind of world can I imagine and put forth? So to answer the question in a different way, I put together some 4 R's for a purposeful education. One is an education that reveals. In other words, what are the underlying values of our current education? We're not going to suddenly get rid of where we are. How can we begin to transition? And one way that I found in some of my experiences is to reveal the values that underpin the world we're a part of, and some of the problems of those underpinnings. If we still hold on to modernist foundations, especially scientific ones, of separability, fragmentation, incompleteness, isolation, those foundations are crumbling. They don't reflect the world that we know, even scientifically or philosophically. And the institutions, all of our social institutions, are created on those foundations. And the stress and the cracks in those foundations are becoming more and more evident in our time. The second R is, besides just revealing what's underpinning where we are, also revealing alternative values. And here's where I look at the Earth Charter again, and other possibilities as well. The second R is regeneration. I'm building on that word. How can we understand ourselves as regenerative, as part of a regenerative natural system? How can we take ideas of the past and have them inform and lead into ideas that we need for the future? How can we regenerate in a transformative sense? What does transformation mean? What does it mean to shift our way of thinking and being and perceiving in the world? Really strong, I think, questions. And we don't often, it is regeneration, even in a developmental sense. Piagetian theory is in a sense, how we transition and transform in our understanding of ourself and world. The third, I'll throw out the re-enchantment, rediscovering the awe and wonder of the natural world and ourselves within it. And the possibilities of our own capacities as human beings, moving toward, a more evolved sense of who we are as humanity, a sense of awe and wonder. And that awe and wonder actually describe what the word sacred, if you look up the word, the meaning of sacred, it's that which inspires awe and wonder. And our education should be filled with that, and with the experiences in nature, and with the participation in our world in various kinds of social ways. And finally, the fourth R, reimagine, reimagination, to begin to reimagine ourselves, who we are as a self, who we are as a community, who we are as a global entity, and who we are, how we fit into and relate as part of the community of life in a planetary perspective. So reveal or revelation, regeneration, re-enchantment, and reimagination, 4 R's.
Thank you, Sam. Let me start getting some comments and questions that we are receiving from our audience, especially through from YouTube. I'm actually very happy to see that Mary Evelyn Tucker is here listening us from YouTube, and she posted a comment, and I just want to read that. So it's a comment from Mary Evelyn Tucker. She says, "Great work, David. As always, your talks, experience, and writings have made a major impact over many decades now. I always appreciate that you call on Thomas Berry as a source of inspiration." Thank you, Mary Evelyn, for being here with us. We have a question from Suparna Diwakar, who says, "How do we transition into education systems or education system that enables this type of education?" Maybe, David, do you want to take that one? How do we transition into an education system that enables this type of education?
Well, that's a great question. And Mary Evelyn being on the call reminds me that we've started a project called the State of American Democracy. And very quickly, the idea is to understand how we build a democracy, a real democracy, for the first time. And I don't think it's an American issue. I suspect that if we were to survey people all over the planet, 7.5 billion of us, and ask what kind of world do you want, and give them voice in their future, my guess is, and I think it's a good guess, is that people would want a very different kind of world. If you ask, you want a changing climate, the answer across the planet would be no. You want clean air, clean water, a world, decent world for your children? The answer would be yes. So in Thomas Berry's frame, our great work is to build a world in which those human aspirations and values can prevail. That's the great work. And it's got to start in education, but also by democratizing the planet. And that means giving people a voice in the kind of world they have. And that's not the world we have now. We live in a world run by a small number of people with a lot of money and a lot of power. My hunch is also people would choose a nonviolent world. Violence toward each other, violence toward nature. I don't think that's buried in the human psyche. I think that is part of the structure of the way we structured power. So I think a better world ahead, getting through this rapids of human history, would be a democratic world run by and for the people, and people that acknowledge that the community includes all of us, all of humanity. It includes all of the life forms on the planet, and it includes the future. We've got to give voice to the future. The last thing I'd say is a book by Elaine Scarry some years back called Thermonuclear Monopoly pointed out that the decision to end life on Earth in a nuclear holocaust will be carried out by a very few number of men. There'll be no democracy. You cannot have a world with nuclear weapons and democracy. That doesn't work. And so it's time to look at the political economy of this planet in the largest sense of the word and make it genuinely democratic for the first time.
Thank you. A question from Gitanjali Paul, who is following us from YouTube. What makes you both hopeful about our education system? What makes you both hopeful about our education system? What do you see as opportunities that we can leverage and enhance for positive, sustainable change that we can build upon? Sam, do you want to go first on this?
Wow. Remaining hopeful is it sounds like it would be easy, but it is not easy for me in these times. However, Peter Cochran, who's very much a part of Earth Charter, has talked about a sense of radical hope. And it's not a Pollyanna wishful thinking. It is a kind of hope that spurs one's actions, one's reflection, one's even cognitive understandings of what's happening. And I think it was the UN assistant to the UN from Costa Rica, I believe her name is Figueroa, who talks about hope as an attitude.
Yeah. Cristiana Figueres.
Figueres, thank you. And I love that. Hope is an attitude and hope is a choice. And we found that even in courses where sustainability is introduced, or the ecological crises are introduced as only a crisis, it tends to actually defeat the purpose of spurring action. It almost de-emphasizes students, especially younger ones. They feel intimidated or hopeless. And when one feels hopeless, you stop acting, you stop participating. And I think it's that word as, or those two words, as if, that are important. William James years ago wrote, I will act as if what I do makes a difference. So that's how I look at hope. And I think instilling that kind of hope is a responsibility for all of us as educators in whatever context we're part of, and trying to not be goal oriented. I'm not doing this because I think it will. I'm not trying to reach a conclusion. I'm involved in a process of doing what I feel and what I'm led to do because it's the right thing. It's who I am. It's part of what my journey on this planet.
Thank you, Sam. David?
I think Sam's comments are just wonderful. Hope is a verb with its sleeves rolled up.
I like that.
And so if you're hopeful, you'll act. And part of your hope comes in doing the act. If you're in despair, you won't act. If you're optimistic, you won't do anything much different. You assume you're going to win. And I think the question of asking whether we're going to make it through human history, going to survive or not, if you ask the question, you'll never act. Better don't pose the question. Be aware that things are dangerous, but don't pose the question. Just get down to work. And I think there's real merit in that. The last thing I'd say is I'm hopeful because all of you are on a call, and there are a lot of millions of us around the world. This is a global movement, and you couldn't have said that 30 years ago, or even maybe 20 years ago. But you can say it now. This is a global movement. And all of you on the call give me reason for hope, and the millions of others doing their parts in small towns in Africa and villages and cities and in all across the planet. So there is a global movement, and our job is to keep at it in the faith that we're right, and whether we win or not, that's not the point, but to keep moving forward.
Thank you, David. This question comes from Sylvia Ferrero, who is following us from YouTube, and I'll ask David to answer that. How to break the chain of corporations in education for the economy in concrete ways?
The corporation, you mean? Well, that goes back to the whole issue of democracy. I mean, we need to take back control, and that gets us down into the hard nitty-gritty of politics. And in this country, we're in the middle of a 5-alarm fire with the Trump administration and an election year. And if we can win the election, then the hard work begins of beginning to rethink how do we do the public business in a way that is genuinely democratic, genuinely inclusive, genuinely fair, open, accountable, and hopefully far-sighted. So that's the project I mentioned, State of American Democracy. So if you go online, I don't want to repeat all this, but if you go online, it's www.stateofamerican.org. And you can see the 7 programs we've had so far online. There are more to come, but it's a large conversation about what it means to make democracy work. And the corporate power is key to that. Corporations in the US law are given the power of being legal persons. Well, all of us on the call are persons. We're going to be in one place at one time, except on Zoom calls. We have limited assets. We're mortal. We die. We have an ethical side to us corporations don't have. And it's a matter of taking that power back. That's the hard work of politics and democracy. And I think we need to take up that work and see that as indispensable to all the work of all of us on the call and beyond.
Thank you. This one I think will go to Sam. It comes from Anupan Sarap. Can you comment on education as the designer of our systems of the future? One that shapes our purposes, interaction, and the measures and values of our actions. Education as the designer of our systems of the future. Sam.
Wow, that's a big question. Thank you for it. I just want to offer a very quick addendum to what David just presented on corporation, and that is that corporations, corporate thinking is built on the idea of growth, infinite growth, which is it's a recipe for disaster in a planetary sense. But so is our education. We're built on the growth, not in a qualitative sense, but in a cumulative sense. So the sense of regeneration is much different, of sharing resources, redistributing, and democracy and democratic participation, yes. To answer Anupat's question, it is interesting to think about systems of education, and I know when we were writing Emergent Teaching, we were looking at the system of education as it is, and how teachers are so often constrained by governments, by their government curriculum, by the pedagogies that are expected and in place. And so we were very aware that those things aren't just going to go away overnight. So our question became, how can we enter those spaces of opportunity? Those spaces of opportunity in every teaching situation, and I'm talking about conventional education right now, that allow us to ask different kinds of questions, that allow us to show even brief elements of a new possible way, and to create emergent assignments where students can spend time digesting, and as David earlier mentioned, mulling over these questions, participating in the world outside and in their community. And those do not have to be subjected to the same kinds of criteria as homework, as assignments. They're expected to process it, to internalize it, and to share then what it is they've done, what it is they've learned from it, what it is they're taking away, and what it is that they're reimagining because of it. And it's in those kinds of emergent assignments, even within very constrained educational environments, conventional ones, that there are these openings. And we found that it is possible when we work with students, with our participants in the certificate programs around the world, whether it's in Europe, India, the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America, and in Asia, they have been able to find these spaces where they can interject in an experiential way, activities and events that shift their thinking about sustainability in this world that we live in. So,
thank you, Sam. I want to acknowledge that we have actually a number of good close friends that are following us through YouTube. Donna Roberts, Mark Hathaway, and a number of our participants of our online education program on ESD. One of them is from Kenya, Lynette Kizaka. A number of professors from the Kenyatta University and others have been following our ESD education program. And Lynette asked the question, education is getting de-linked from schooling. How can we, as Earthshadow educators, tap into online learning for ESD through the Earthshadow? So that comes from Lynette, who is following this conversation from Kenya. Who wants to go?
David.
David, how can we tap into online learning for ESD through the Earthshadow?
Well, I didn't start as a fan of online learning. So I've been skeptical about what happens online. We've seen, however, with the pandemic here, so much of our dialogue is now as this, the Zoom call and learning online. I think it's a bit of a substitute for actual experience, for face-to-face education, but I'm probably the worst person ever to try to answer a question like that. What the internet does is to allow us to move things very quickly. And so we can move information very fast, and you can put a whole lot of things online, and that's very valuable. You can Google Earthshadow or any number of things, and you can look things up, and information is very quickly accessible. My worry about it is that it's superficial. It operates at a level that doesn't really reach where we are. We'll do what we have to do for the pandemic, and information we're in this world now, and so information and data will circulate. But I think it should not displace.
genuine learning. I think Earth Charter and all organizations will use websites and so forth to convey lots of information. But that is so different, as has been pointed out for decades, so different than wisdom. Knowledge in wisdom and learning and information are very different categories. And I think our striving ought to always be toward that deeper thing that we call wisdom. It's rare. It takes a lifetime probably to acquire much of it, although people like Greta Thunberg show it at very early ages. But I think that we have to do what we have to do, but I'm skeptical of online learning. My last caveat is one of our partners in the Democracy Initiative is Arizona State University, and they have figured out how to make learning and degree granting experiences available to people who otherwise would never get it, but who need it. And so I think it's a good way to start some things, but you hope it's not where we end, that all of our learning experiences go in examples like we're experiencing here. I'd be much happier being with all of you in a room and talking and face to face and sharing meals and quitting here and going out and playing volleyball or something. But we'll do what we have to do. But let's not mistake what we have to do in a certain situation with the best answer to very profoundly important questions.
Sam, do you want to add to that? And I'm going to ask you another question that comes from Donna Roberts, who I'm very happy that she's here following us. She asked a question to you, Sam. You talked about regenerate ourselves. So the question, how to understand ourselves as part of a regenerative natural system? So Sam, if you want to add to what David just said, and then go to the Donna Roberts question.
Yes, David's answer was beautiful. I think online learning is, I know in our community, parents are worried, and I live in a community where there's a lot of nature around, but because of online learning, kids are in front of the computer longer and longer and longer periods of time. So we're getting together to see if we can do outdoor extensions with students in the area where they can be a part, do some things in the nature center, and also to begin looking at, I live in California, which is fire prone. Can we even engage students in doing fire prevention and that in a group sense that also protects and the forest that we're a part of here. So we're looking at those kinds of questions. I think they're important. And I will say one other thing. There are some integrative models that can use the online systems very effectively. And those integrative models, if we were to approach a potent question at different levels and at different environments around the world, and have classrooms or even schools investigate and explore and act upon those things with communication one to another, learning from each other. These systems can allow that to happen. Schools connected to school here, connected to one in India, to one in Costa Rica, to one in Canada, to one in France, and to begin to look at the same problems from different angles and perspectives and begin to share that research. So I'll stop there. And to the question on regeneration, how does one regenerate oneself? I do believe it's to begin to see ourselves and understand ourselves as natural organisms, and with this, we participate in the cycle of life and death, and how life needs death to continue, and how death needs life to renew itself. And these come home to us sometimes in personal ways, but to see ourselves as part of this. I love Maturana's working, his thinking along this line as well, that borders are not barriers. Borders are connectors. And so, and as we look at cognitive science, we start to understand that we couple with the environment. We couple all the time. That is physiologically and neurologically what we do. We're always coupling with the environment around us. We're part of it, and it's part of us. And that perspective, if we don't begin to perceive ourselves and the world around us from that perspective, we can't really be part of the regenerative process, at least cognitively, only physically. And so when we can integrate those into a more spiritual whole of who we are, it will naturally benefit the world in our own unique and personal ways.
Thank you, Sam. And thank you for remembering the two questions. I do want to make a comment about the question that came from Kenya on online learning. I think in terms of futures of education, this is a technology that came to stay. And I agree with the notion that, well, it limits to a certain extent, but also I think it expands the possibilities. It doesn't mean that we have to only be limited to online learning, but how can we look at that from a perspective of expanding the possibilities and adapting ourselves to current times? So we, over the past, actually 10 years, we started with an online course for young leaders first. And the purpose was education, engaging, and training young leaders on ethical leadership for sustainability. And I can say that one thing, and the space was online learning. And I can testify that there was a lot of transformative learning taking place in the space of online learning. And I think one of the reasons is being able to connect with people from different cultural contexts have been quite transformative. It's not expensive. I think the big advantage here also is that people can be in their country, in their houses, and not necessarily take a plane to travel around the world to go and meet people from across the world, and actually be able to make the most of that learning space. But in the past 5 years, we have actually, I think we have improved and learned and how to bring pedagogies from a face-to-face setting into online learning in a way that it is connecting, that it is transformative, that it's engaging. So I think there's a lot of room still to expand and for all of us to make better use of the new technology, and especially when we are now with so much need of a planetary understanding of what's happening in the world and our interdependence, and to elevate our consciousness as planetary citizens. So I think things are changing. And actually, even nowadays, we have more and more possibilities of having small breakout rooms with a big group in an online setting. So anyway, I just wanted to add to that point. And now I want to bring one point from Abelardo Brenes. So Abelardo has written extensively on universal responsibility. And his question to you, to David and Sam, is the notion of global or planetary citizenship was addressed as a concept that is assumed as positive. Does it have also maybe possible negative implications? So the question is, does the concept of global or planetary citizenship has any possible negative implications. And he says, I say this because a citizenship relationship assumes a political set of relationship between citizens and the collective in case, in which there is a constitution and governance. The Earthshot is a soft law document, not linked to any global governance, hard law settings. So what do you think of that? Does it have any negative implications, the concept of planetary citizenship?
If that's to me, it's one of those ambiguous things like light is particle and wave, both. Do we need global connectedness in some fashion? The answer has to be yes. Whether we can involve the institutions that make that a reality, the answer is unknown. We haven't done a very good job of that at this point. If that means, however, creating loyalties that are supposedly only global and not local, I think it could be a disaster. People live in places and they need to be competent in those places. They need to understand their ecologies, their cultures, their history, their landscapes, and there needs to be affection given and care given to those places. So it's one of these ambiguous things, and I think that we've come to the point of history where we have to evolve some global institutions that work. We cannot let nuclear weapons, for example, be distributed around the world without control. They need to be eliminated eventually, somehow, by some means. We can't let corporations run the whole planet. They need to be brought under some kind of control. And the technologies, which are now the fear I have about, one of the fears I have about technology is they eventually take over. They've created this enormous mass of money at the very top of the income spectrum. Google and Facebook and so forth are enormously powerful organizations and incredibly wealthy. And where wealth gets that concentrated, oligarchy is not far behind. I think that's the world we're now living in. It's a world we will not be free in that world. And our choices will be increasingly constrained by what is technologically feasible, which will be further constrained by what is profitable to the people who own the technological systems. So there are these big issues that need resolution at the global scale. And I think the good news or bad news is we have to do both. We have to find rootedness in place and be competent in place. But we also will need to evolve global institutions and behaviors and patterns. And I'm one with Rick Steves about global travel. I think some of the best experiences I've ever had are getting in high technology airplanes and flying to other parts of the world, meeting people and participating, whether it's South Asia or Eastern Europe or the Far East. Those have changed how I saw the world in a way that conversations like this can't. This is a good form if you have not other alternatives. And it's a good supplement, but it's one that needs to be as part of a menu of our choices of how to interact with whom, where, and under what circumstances. That's an ambiguous answer, but I don't think there's an unambiguous, accurate answer that can be given to that question. It's just a very good question. I think we need to keep asking it.
Wonderful. And I think it was very clear. So Sam, I'm going to give it to you, but we are going to have to close very soon. And I still want to share 2 questions from the audience.
I just want to add one perspective that I think I love the question as well. Thank you, Abelardo. That's one of the reasons I use planetary citizenship as opposed to global citizenship. Global seems to be talking about human societies, and I think our perspective needs to be larger. And whose voices are we hearing? So I like to think of giving voice to voices that matter. And I think it was on a previous webinar, someone said that whatever gathering we have, let's put out several different chairs that are empty. One of those chairs is for the children who are yet to be born. Another chair is for the marginalized in our world who are not given voice and or not allowed to participate. And then another chair would be for our natural systems of life, the rivers, the mountains, the air, who speaks for them. So it seems that any kind of planetary citizenship, we need to engage those who are not present in our group and honor their voices and make them accessible.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you. So a question from Fatima de Oliveira. Maybe Sam, you could take that one. Would you agree that education should focus on helping people to create value for their lives and their communities?
Absolutely. So I could just say yes, I would agree with that. Value, I mean, life, what values are we talking about? And so I think one of the wonderful contributions of the Earth Charter is that we have this value of diversity and respect and care. And I think it's actually, I believe it's a biologically innate aspect of who we are, caring. We're made to care. It's from the maternal instinct, from the family instinct. And so the way we care and the way we project that is a value. And there are multiple values around that: love, reverence, using the heart and the mind, and so forth. The value of biophilia that Fritjof often talks about, that came from E.O. Wilson, that sense of life, love of living systems. And when we love it and appreciate it, and we recognize our part in it and it's part of us, then that love is unbounded. And I think love is a value, but it's also an action and it's also an attitude. And then we have the sense of fairness that kids, even before they're taught, they seem to know what's not fair. They may not know that sense of, and I don't mean equity in just a technical sense, but a sense of giving voice to those around us, to looking at the equity in the distribution. We've been talking about corporations and how greed and all of these non-values are interpreting our world for us. And then finally, that sense of peace and well-being. We all want to have a sense that we belong, that we're healthy, that we're safe. The conversation of nuclear weaponry and conflict. It's not that conflict is bad, it's the way we deal with conflict, and how do we find peaceful ways of listening and accepting and entertaining people's ideas and cultures and perspectives. It's the Earth Charter to me is the container of these values and shows how they can be put into action through its various principles.
Thank you, Sam. I would like just to bring a comment from Maria Garcia, who is following us from the Netherlands. And Maria says, as a teacher in higher education, I would like to say a lot of us working at the front are doing a lot of the things you have mentioned today. At least we are trying. Yet the bureaucracy around education, regulations, traditional forms of examination, accreditations are still so constraining because education is analytical and comfortable in their siloed world. So this was a comment from Maria Garcia, and I would like to leave it if you want to make a comment, but we have to close, and I would like to ask David and Sam to give your concluding remarks, and maybe if you want to reflect on inevitable major changes in education practice for the future.
Don't we go first?
Yes.
Let me just say very briefly how grateful I am, Miriam, for you to organize this event, and Sam to be with you. And it's been a great conversation. I look forward to having an in-person conversation with you when the pandemic is over. I think our role is to prevail. I don't know if education's made a technical discipline. I think we lose it. It is not a matter of technology that can help. It's not a matter of rules and regulations and even curricula. It's this mysterious process of igniting something in the mind of individual people, and nobody is like anybody else. Abraham Lincoln in American history was educated mostly by himself, reading, as we're told, by firelight or candlelight, and turned language into a political art form that's never been bettered, at least in our history. I think our role, whether it's teachers constrained by bureaucracy or whatever we are, is to make our students dangerous people. And by dangerous, I mean dangerous to complacency, to the status quo, to cruelty, to indifference, to all of those things that constrain the human future. We need to educate people who are subversive and dangerous. And that is, if there's a human future, it's always been made by people at its best who have been dangerous to the status quo as they knew it and as they experienced it. So against all those rules and regulations and constraints, find little ways to do something different. Subvert the system by inches, not by yards, if necessary. The big gains will come, but I think educating people who are dangerous to all the forces that have brought human civilization to the brink of disaster is our role.
Wow, I don't think I could say anything to add to that in a way, but I do want to express my appreciation also to you, David. Just so inspired by your work and your comments today, and your dedication to this area. And Miriam, the work that you and your colleagues do at the Earth Charter, I just don't think it gets enough recognition how the important contribution you make. And so you work so hard. I'm aware of that, and I have to just tell the world, these individuals, Miriam and her staff, Alicia and Amanda and Javiera, it's a small staff, and they just work tirelessly for us. And I'm so appreciative of the work you do and the opportunity to share. I will say that in terms of the question, the inevitability, I don't know that anything is inevitable. I tend to look at the world more from an emergent perspective, that chaos and purposeful emergence is full of possibility. And so we make choices along the way, from Spanish poco a poco, little by little. But at the same time, from a systems perspective, we are not just one person making a difference one by one. From a systems perspective, everything you do, everything you say, your actions in the world, your communication, your relationships, everything is making a difference all the time. And we just don't know what kind of difference that is. So the question isn't whether we can make a difference, it's what kind of difference are we going to make? And so I'll leave with that question, and because that's, I think, where our hope lies, in how we bring forth our own gifts, the gifts of who we are, each one of us individually, how we bring that gift into the world and let it be together with others doing the same thing.
Thank you so much, in my deep appreciation and gratitude to Sam Crowell, to David Orr, and to our guest speakers today, but also to our audience, friends and people from around the world who have been following this conversation today. I think it has been very rich, and I'm really deeply grateful. I do think that education is undergoing major changes, the way we look at education, at least from my daughter's perspective, who is a teenager. She's a 16-year-old and in secondary school. And I can see every day in my house that she's approaching education in a completely different way than I did. And she's absorbing information from everywhere, certainly not just the school. So I think we are in a major paradigm shift in the way we look at education, whether we want to see it or not. Maybe, as Maria Garcia said, the education systems are a little slow in seeing that, but the reality is that the children, the students, the learners who are in schools or universities, they are already learning in a different way. And I think it's for all of us in our different realms and generations to be more flexible and to adapt, but really look at the role of education as a driver for social transformation, and to reorient our civilization to a more just and sustainable world. So thank you so much. And we are now closing this session and this webinar, and all the best. Thank you.